I have recommended a lot of things over my time on this platform. One of my favorite things to do is talk about manga that isn't usually mentioned in videos and bring a little more attention to them, but as time has gone on and more people have begun making content, it has become tricky. Yet there is one series I read a while ago that is long overdue, a series I believe you should read before checking out any other manga, Blade of the Immortal. There are a few heads up in regards to the series that need to be addressed, outside of this story being graphic, very graphic at times, one for the convenience of the reader. This manga is read left to right, so keep that in mind because it definitely threw me off a few times and took a little bit to get used to. And the second one I addressed back when I was talking about a series, the name won't be mentioned. This is a Buddhist symbol of peace that was then corrupted in World War II by a guy who should have just been accepted into art school, but I guess hindsight is 2020. The manga begins with a swordsman that has killed 100 men. An attempt to assassinate him fails, and that's when it's revealed that he is immortal. Covered in scars, one eye, 100 manslayer, I think you could see why this might get lumped in with other series already. This is Manji, a swordsman that has been given magic worms by some old lady that allows Manji to heal from any injury he sustains. Well, almost every injury. At first, this might present itself with the internal question of why should I care about any conflict in regards to a character that can't die, an overpowered MC if you will, and I think the author thought that through since the real conflict with Manji is actually a moral one, and his convictions are shaped by his own mistakes since one of the 100 men he has killed was his beloved sister's husband, and he has to witness her get murdered. And so now he has to make things right by killing 1,000 evil individuals. Also, he can be killed, and there are some specifics that the story addresses pretty early on in regards to that, and the fights are stellar regardless. In actuality, it's because of the insanity that Manji is capable of. His immortality is more so that he can be killed, it's just that most people don't have the resources to carry that out. So getting into Blade of the Immortal, especially if you have read some of the other prominent seinen manga, one would think that this is going to be another story that delves into this one character with all of the ins and outs and watch this character drastically change. But that's not entirely the case because Manji isn't the only primary character of the story. That spotlight and role is shared with Rin, a girl that has her father and mother killed by a group of swordsmen known as the Ituryu, and swears vengeance on them and employs Manji as her bodyguard. A character that is trying to make amends for living a lifestyle of murder, and someone who's trying to throw themselves into it to avenge her fallen loved ones. Written by Hiroaki Samura from the end of Jordan's first three-peat and LeBron's first championship ring, Blade of the Immortal is a great showcase of his artistic ability when it comes to portraying beauty and extreme violence. Something he put on display in another work, a one-shot doujinshi titled Night of the Succubus, as well as non-doujin works such as Die War Gelder. There's also a sequel to Blade of the Immortal which is ongoing, but I won't be talking about that in this video since it only has a few chapters out. It also has a live action, which I'm not sure how good it is, but I heard both anime adaptations were a bit poo-poo stinky. It was inspired by Tange Sazin, not sure if I mentioned that properly, but it's a swordsman with one eye and one arm that would appear throughout a lot of different Japanese television and film. The Blade of the Immortal manga has shades of some of my favorites ever. The main one that it will draw a lot of comparisons to, unfortunately, is Vagabond. Look, comparing these two for the sake of which one is better is just a disservice to both stories, since the only thing they have in common is the setting and the implementation of brush art style. The core themes and messages, as well as the style and character focus, is fundamentally different. Vagabond, I think, because it focuses so much on one character for the majority of the story, and then takes some time to focus on others, such as Sasaki Kojiro and a little bit of Matahachi, it provides a main character that very few series can match. Blade of the Immortal, on the other hand, focuses on many different key characters and plot points at different parts in the story and then ties them all together. And so in that sense, it has a more plot-oriented style of character focus. In other words, Vagabond is a far more character-driven story, greatly focused on the details of a few characters, while Blade of the Immortal has a far more broad scope, leading to a very different experience. It actually reminds me a little bit of Hajime no Ippo and Ashita no Joe, where it's like, yes, they're both boxing series, but each of those series have such different strengths and reasons to love and enjoy each one that it gets on my nerves. But anywho, this story also heavily delves into the idea of revenge, so some might compare it here and there to Vinland. But look, if you were to legitimately force a comparison with this manga beyond just the aesthetic, if I could go, okay, if you like this manga, then you'll like Blade of the Immortal, I would argue in terms of story structure and strengths and focus, I would say it's a little more similar to Hell's Paradise than actually any of the major seinen titles that it will get grouped with. The main differences is, of course, the specifics with the characters. I think Blade of the Immortal has a far more grounded plot, a far more graphic and explicit story, and almost 100 more chapters to explore the characters and have them be involved in the plot. But I think they have a very similar style of focusing on all these different characters and then bringing them all together. I say all of this because I totally understand where some of these comparisons come from, but this really is its own story, and that can largely be seen by starting with the main character, Manji. He's an interesting case since he is for the most part a completed character, sort of like with Kenshin and Gintoki, but even then he's different, where a lot of what he's gone through is before the story starts and is actually largely dealt with in the first chapter. He does grow and change subtly, but it's the female lead of the story, Rin, that goes through a large amount of the progression and development and is the focal point of the thematic question of how we deal with revenge and what a life of vengeance leads to. More specifically, the morality behind it, and because of the premise of the story, Manji comes off more like a force of nature. Think in Old Man Logan or Guts in the Lost Children arc, someone that we observe through the POV of others. It's almost as if there was this non-existent prequel that we never ever see, and now we are seeing how this made man has an impact on those around him, and how he is impacted in return. And so I think this allows Blade of the Immortal to not just have one strong main character, but its biggest strength is it has one of the best casts in all of manga. Manji himself, Rin, Kagehisa, my favorite character in the story, Maki, I believe that's how it's pronounced, Hyakurin, Kagimura, are all some of the best in their respective roles and provide a different perspective and answer in the form of their outcome to dealing with a life plagued by death and revenge. There are some other characters in the cast as well that provide some really memorable moments, like Gichi, someone I did not expect to grow attached to. So going into this for the first time, given the first few chapters, one might be led to believe that Manji will hold the majority of your interest, but it grows quickly into a living, breathing world with many storylines you wish to see fulfilled and that you're invested in. It is worth keeping in mind, however, that when you kind of have this sort of thing, the middle part of the story, when one of these characters is introduced for the first time, the story feels like it slows down quite a bit, but in the end, it all comes together beautifully. In fact, the author's motto when it came to making this manga was to focus on the overall story and not the details, which isn't to be conflated with a lack of depth, although you do inherently sacrifice delving into a character even more, but if not an emphasis on all the different parts that work together. Many stories evolve in a similar way that Blade of the Immortal does, where the original and simple goal of going after a few individuals, or this simple goal in general, causes the characters to get involved in a far larger mess than they signed up for. This can be tricky since if the concept of the plot is what created the tension and the intrigue, by changing that you run the risk of losing a large portion of your audience, as was the case with Promised Neverland. But I think Blade of the Immortal goes about it in a natural way where things slowly open up more and more while new pieces are added to the puzzle, instead of the door being completely kicked open. As well as I think the big intrigue with Blade of the Immortal after the first initial chapters are the characters, and not just the premise of going after this group of swordsmen. The original idea of Manji and Rin going after the Itoryu eventually gets them involved in the other forces in Japan also going after the Itoryu, some of which are individuals just as evil that get themselves into being targets for Manji as well. It also keeps conflicts interesting by focusing on other characters and providing a good mix of antagonists, characters that are far more nuanced and human than they might have seemed upon introduction, and others that are so detestably grotesque that it creates a huge amount of satisfaction when they finally get dealt with. I think a lot of the stories that I find very interesting do a good job of this, since it helps encounters feel fresh as the plot moves forward. I think the action is great in this manga, some of my favorite, not only from an art and paneling standpoint with some beautiful eye catchers at the climax of the fight, but also the pain these characters go through is the core of their character, and they often have to go face to face with the cause of their suffering or a reminder of what changed their life forever. And so I think every fight scene, every moment of action in the series is worth feeling invested in, and you stay immersed into it, because I think one of the worst things is feeling as if the action only exists to move the plot forward, or just because a fight was needed there, and it never feels connected to the characters. The action feeling separate from the story or the author not using those moments of giant conflict to then explore the character. I know I said not to compare the two, but Vagabond is amazing at this, as Inoue's goal was to explore Musashi before, during, and especially after each encounter, while Blade of the Immortal does an amazing job at this by tying characters to one another, or exploring each of these characters and making make them question their current way of living in contrast with one another. They grow from interacting, which helps them feel alive and worth being invested in, despite their legitimate flaws. Some of them evolve by interacting and learning lessons from people they would have never thought possible. Sworn enemies having to form temporary alliances is a big thing in this manga, which makes for surprising moments where characters learn valuable lessons from the people they would least expect to learn from, as well as a constant feeling of tension and just conflict, because you never really know where it's going to go next with a specific character. With there also being a mix of romance and romantic tragedy as well as pure tragedy, the author makes it so that you never really know what to expect in general in regards to the outcome of said characters while you read it. So if you're tired of reading manga where characters feel like unrealized potential, then I think Blade of the Immortal would be a breath of fresh air. I think at its best, this is a fantastic manga with a wonderful cast of characters that seem to always shift as the plot progresses. Memorable characters with some moments that will stay with you for a very long time. And at worst, it's a cool story about a badass immortal swordsman and a maturing female lead trying to get revenge on a samurai group and the powers that be. Personally, I believe the story has a lot more than that to offer, especially because of its themes, dealing with the passing of ages and traditions, as seen with Kagehisa, finding a way to create a new life and move on from the pains of the past with pretty much every damn character in the series, and living a life of redemption as seen with Manji, Gichi, and Hyakuren. There's a strong overlap with various messages, more than the ones I just listed, that all come together and answer the question of what gives life meaning, and other questions as well, such as what we can do to add meaning when we feel like there's no chance for hope or purpose. Especially for a man that can live for hundreds of years if he so chooses. How much are you willing to go through in order to see your dreams fulfilled, and what lines are you willing to cross to complete your revenge? I think the ending to this manga is interesting with some room for discussion, since I found it satisfactory, although a tad bittersweet, which was to be expected given how certain things were built up. I don't want to call this series underrated, since most who have read it hold it in very high regards, but I do think, like Yusugoi, this is a series that deserves to be brought up a lot more. I don't know the exact number, but I've recommended a lot, and I'm sure most of you watching this video have read a lot. But if you haven't read this, before you read any other manga, read this.